and I am a consultant with Canberra Collective. I am incredibly delighted to welcome you all to our Skull World Forum virtual ecosystem event. Today, we'll be engaging a panel to discuss We Can't Fix What We Don't See, promoting collaboration for the space of mobility from poverty. We really hope you've enjoyed the conference over the last few days and are glad you could participate in this forum. And a special thanks to our Director of Impact and Equity, Rosella Kennedy, and the forum leaders for spearheading the creation of these important spaces. As we're all getting settled here, I can let you know we'll be doing like a quick introduction of our firm and our excellent panelists. We'll then share our findings from a field assessment we conducted in the space, and then we'll engage in a discussion with these panel of leaders from the field. So let's get started. So we are Canberra Collective. We are strategy consultants supporting the social impact space. We are a group of leaders who bring our lived experience, our sector and systems knowledge, and our functional expertise in strategy, insights, and coalition building to drive impact. And we, as part of our shared prosperity portfolio, were commissioned by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation through a team of three of us, Mark Allen, Ted Schneider, and myself, to define and map the field of economic mobility, identify the appropriate metrics to measure its development, and ultimately evaluate the field to identify those opportunities for strategic field building. We researched and spoke with over 150 plus stakeholders in the field, ranging from longstanding philanthropies such as Robin Hood, Annie Casey, Ford Foundation, among many others, to movement-led organizations such as One Fair Wage and the New Economy Coalition. Our work ultimately led to an assessment of three primary fields that assess its strengths related to its stakeholders and its leadership, its knowledge base, their relative goal setting, their ability to collaborate, which we'll discuss today further, its resourcing, and its ability to engage folks from different racial and gender equity backgrounds. So today, our managing partner and co-founder, Ted Schneider, will lead us through an engaging discussion with our panelists, and I'll lead us through some content, and then our engagement manager, Mark Allen, will be available for questions. Now, honoring our guests for the hour, I'd like to formally introduce our panelists. Rachel Korberg, Executive Director of Families and Workers Fund. She has spent more than 2 decades in the mobility from poverty space, serving a range of roles at Ford Foundation and Rockefeller, among others. In her current role, she focuses on workforce development and building more equitable and effective public benefit systems. Rachel, we're really glad to have you join us. Next, we have...
Thanks for having me. Thrilled to be here.
Thank you. Next, we have Gary Cunningham, President and CEO of Prosperity Now, and he is known for being a thought leader in entrepreneurship, job creation, and racial wealth equity. And prior to his role, he served in a variety of leadership roles in economic development, healthcare, and housing. Gary, we're super pleased to have you with us as well, and glad all the tech issues worked out.
Thank you, Leah. I'm so pleased to be here with this great panel.
Excellent. And finally, we have Mary Bogle, Principal Research Associate with the Metropolitan Housing and Communities Policy Center at the Urban Institute. And over the course of Mary's career, she has worked extensively with community-based organizations, government agencies, and foundations to plan, implement, and evaluate programs aimed at creating more prosperous futures for children and families. Thanks for being with us today, Mary.
Pleased to be here. Thanks.
So with our guests of honor formally introduced, let's move into the content so we can frame up some of this discussion. So in our experience advising and shaping quite a few fields, including polio and family planning and cybersecurity, we know that the hallmark for most successful fields is having a clear goal. Let's take polio, for example. The goal is clear: eradication. This level of clarity and goal setting can lead to several outcomes: an agreement on overall strategy and path to success, adequate funding support, effective collaboration, and coordinated leadership, all of which are necessary for sustainable fields that seek to move the needle. Now, through our field assessment, we learned that mobility from poverty lacks the singular goal that is typically required for field building to succeed. And we have specifically coined mobility from poverty as a space, because as a space, it seems to incorporate a number of stakeholders working within the realm of socioeconomic challenges, but not necessarily operating against the same goals or the same approaches. So our assessment revealed that the reason why the mobility from poverty field lacks this clear defined goal is that first, there's no clear definition metrics. For us, it was difficult to parse whether a health organization who addressed systemic issues and recognized the link between poverty and health outcomes was part of the space or not. A space that was well-defined would thus have a concise goal. This led to difficulties with defining appropriate metrics to measure the space or field success, which is where we were brought in. Related to this was the great number of issue areas and factors that influence economic mobility and opportunity in the US, including the issues of work, education, health, housing, safety nets, and civic engagement, among many others. Each of these in their own right have their own goals and outcomes to achieve, but they also, as we understand from social determinants, correlate with poverty and mobility outcomes. And so again, it becomes difficult to parse out whether that success can be attributed to mobility from poverty. The space also holds stark ideological differences. There were some organizations we noticed in our assessment who held strong beliefs to uphold capitalism, neoliberalist principles, and the idea that free markets and less regulation and government intervention will generate the most economic opportunity. And then on the other end, we noticed groups who really sought to fully reimagine capitalism and redefine principles on wealth redistribution and power dynamics. These groups all might believe in more opportunity for Americans, but they have completely different ideological principles and paths to get there. And so we learned that this active tension really prevented progress in the space. And finally, although the field had quite a number of longstanding organizations and demonstrated leadership across the academic, philanthropic, corporate, and government sectors, there were very few that have formally and consistently sought to play a field building function. An explicit field builder can take responsibility for convening, developing public goods, holding spaces for collaboration, pooling those resources, connecting those stakeholders, and really galvanizing them towards a common strategic goal. So the lack of goal clarity in the mobility from poverty space has resulted in stakeholders describing the space in many distinct terms, with some being seen as complementary, while others are viewed in more competitive tension. So in our assessment, we heard that stakeholders who shared these common goals tended to cluster around specific terms, and we reflected that here. The first, on the far left and more of the teal green, is a group of terms addressing poverty alleviation and generating economic security. In our research, we noticed these terms are often associated with longstanding orgs and frequently used by frontline organizations. It was critiqued as insufficiently aspirational by some, given that anti-poverty measures were only addressing a specific subset of the population rather than the broader groups of Americans trying to achieve mobility. The second group included terms we commonly associate with the American dream, such as economic opportunity and economic mobility. And these terms have grown more widespread over the years, in large part due to the landmark research done by Raj Chetty and the Opportunity Insights team, and they've been more perceived as bipartisan and consensus building from a policy perspective. They were more broadly critiqued by power building organizations in our assessment, who believe the ideas of climbing an economic ladder in order to achieve the so-called American dream were outdated and ineffective. The third group, which includes terms such as economic paradigms, shared prosperity, and inclusive growth, were often used by system and cross-sector focused organizations, and those focused on creating more longer-term changes. The outcomes were seen as hard to quantify and slightly nebulous, but there were notions of value and belonging that appealed to many stakeholders working towards these goals. And then the final group of terms were more often used by power building or movement-led organizations who believed in radical systems change related to wealth redistribution or achieving reparations. And these groups often challenged the notion of mobility as a whole to being an appropriate goal and achieved for more of a systems that was achieving equity overall. Now, the terms themselves and the clustering of those stakeholders and the outcomes that they most resonated with broadly mapped into 3 fields within the mobility from poverty space, each with a unique mission. So here is the framework where we are showing the 3 fields that our panelists will discuss today. On the left is economic security. This field's mission in the broader space is focused on meeting essential needs and ensuring that individuals and communities have their baseline needs met. So we might expect organizations working on anti-poverty measures such as housing or health, for example, to align in this field. In the middle is economic opportunity, which is focused on increasing skills, qualifications, and raising the earning potential. We commonly think of issue areas like work or education to support the mission in this field. And on the right is the field of value and belonging or economic paradigms, whose mission is to define the paradigms and practices that impact economic dignity, influence, and inclusion. So this 3-field mapping frame can also be seen in evolved thinking from organizations such as the Urban Institute and the Institute of Othering Belonging. This evolution into viewing the space as 3 fields rather than as 1 field is meant to provide greater structure and clarity around goals. So stakeholders, regardless of their ideological perspective or place of activation, whether that be at the systems or individual level, can align and thus move the needle. This structure, as we'll discuss today, may or may not be helpful in terms of galvanizing stakeholders towards common paths, but this is the discussion that we would love to have with all of you. So Ted, I will hand it off to you now to begin.
Leanna, thanks so much for that very comprehensive overview of the thinking and the framing that went into this discussion and the work that we did. I want to just say a few words before we turn to the panelists. I would love to just start with gratitude again for the Skoll World Forum. I think to have this platform is a real honor, and I just appreciate the way that Skoll has made this entire forum more accessible to a lot of different people and really democratized access to all this important content. I'm really grateful to our panelists. Rachel, Mary, Gary have all been incredible partners to us as we've gone through this work, and thought partners helped push our thinking, and I'm grateful for that partnership, but also for you being here today. And also grateful to the team at the Gates Foundation for funding this work and allowing us to have this incredible opportunity to work in this space. This is one of those projects as a consultant, you really cherish the opportunity to get this deep into a space. So it's been a real privilege for all of us. One comment on the 3-field frame that I think we really strongly believe in as an organizing principle that would benefit this space of mobility from poverty. We don't claim to have originated this 3-field frame. I think it has real foundation, especially in the work of the U.S. Mobility Partnership that really, I think, began to talk about the space in these 3 different fields around economic security, economic mobility, and value and belonging. So I think what we're proposing here is really just a solidification off of that. I want to just make sure that we, honor the work that came before us in this. My final thing I would say before I get the panelists talking and hopefully talking with each other is we would encourage people to use the chat if you have questions as we go through this. We would love to hear those. We will try at the end to field a question or two also that comes through the chat. So don't be shy if something strikes you to put it in the chat, and we'll try to field those. Well, let's turn to the panelists. Panelists, again, thank you for being here. I would love to just begin with having you tell us a little bit about your organizations, your primary remit, And again, using that 3-field frame, if there's one or maybe multiple fields that you feel like you're working within, would love to hear how that fits for you. Rachel, you're in my top left, so I'd love to maybe start with you.
Absolutely. Well, thank you again for having me. Rachel Korberg, she, hers. I'm the executive director of the Families and Workers Fund. And we are the first national multi-donor collaborative that is dedicated to an equitable, good jobs economic recovery from COVID-19. So we work to build that more equitable economy, and we focus on advancing jobs that sustain and uplift people and on delivering equitable, effective benefits with a focus on workers. Right now, we're about a $54+ million fund, but of course, we think about our assets much more broadly than that, and really all of the assets that our members are bringing. We're co-chaired by Darren Walker, president of the Ford Foundation, and Eric Braverman, CEO of Schmidt Futures. And our collaborative represents about 20 diverse leading philanthropies, including the Skoll Foundation, who sits on our executive committee, I should disclose. In terms of which field that we fit into, I actually think we do very intentionally work across all three of those fields. And we're really proud to have foundations that are kind of core stakeholders in each of those spaces. I would say most of our work does focus on the first two, right? On more economic security and economic mobility. But for us, that work can only be effective if you're really centering the lens of the third field, which is about work that is for and by workers and those who are most directly impacted, that centers equity. And that is very real about dignity and belonging being so central to what really will enable economic security and mobility.
Thank you, Rachel. Gary, would love to hear from you next.
Well, thanks, Ted and Leanne, for having me here today. Just to give you a little background, Prosperity Now has been a persistent voice in championing economic opportunity, both outside and beyond the existing systems of power in all of these communities. We advance racial and economic justice by investing in bold new ideas and addressing issues of the ecosystem that people are operating in that maintains the structures that we have. With regards to the three areas that we're talking about, Prosperity Now has worked in all three areas. We have actually shifted our frame in the last 2 years to focus more in the areas of economic opportunity and valuing belonging and economic paradigm. And the reason is what we've come to believe is that the solutions that we're trying to derive are much bigger than what we have coming through the funnel in terms of how we work on these issues across all these different platforms. And so if we don't work under underlying systems, and I'll give you an example of that, one of our reports shows that it'd take over 250 years for Black people to equal the wealth that whites have today. And I could go on. We did another report that showed that by 2050, both Black and Latino families will have significant debt, in fact, have zero wealth in that period of time. So the trillions of dollars that will be necessary to right these issues really have to be dealt with on a systemic level. And the issues that continue the legacy of segregation, denied opportunity, et cetera, that we still live with today can't be dealt with just by mitigating the effects of a broken system. And so we actually work on that end of the spectrum in part, and I'll get into this a little further, but we can't continue as a country to not invest in our safety net, but also in our economic mobility. Thomas Pickering wrote a tome pretty much on capital and ideology. He's an economist in France that looked at economic inequality worldwide. And what he found was that the United States of industrial nations is spending less than most other industrialized nations on our safety net. So you can't, I mean, you can do all kind of somersaults and all kind of contortions, but at the end of the day, if you're not addressing the issue of how wealth is distributed through our tax system and other systems, we're not going to get there from here. So it can't be another program. It really has to be systemic structural change in our society.
That's great. Thank you, Gary. Mary, would love to have you introduce yourself and the work you do at the Urban Institute.
Great. As the introduction said, I am a principal research associate with the Urban Institute in the Metropolitan Housing and Communities Policy Center. Urban works a lot on issues of upward mobility and equity, using social and economic policy research to find solutions. One of the ironies of Urban is it's a 50-year-old institution. So it's interesting that we are in the paradigm busting bucket, or the new paradigms bucket, in a sense, because we did help facilitate the U.S. Partnership on Mobility, and I was very involved in writing some of the framing papers for that work. But Urban itself is siloed into these policy centers, like mine is most analogous to housing, right? And one of the things, and I'm going to talk about it more in my remarks, is that we've done in recent years is a lot of cross-center initiatives. I work across policy centers constantly because I'm one of the more, I always tell people I know a few things deeply, like early childhood, and a little bit about everything else, enough to be dangerous. And so I have a broader perspective. But Urban itself is moving in that direction. I think one of the biggest things Urban has done to help its research is drawn on the lived experience of folks we do research, not on, but with. And so even in my research, I'm incorporating community-based researchers. We're doing community advisory boards. And I think things like the framework, which is definitely, I can see the roots of the U.S. Partnership for Mobility from Poverty in that. I think those help and are essential because of the siloed nature and the crazy, we don't have a pathway out of poverty or pathway past income inequality. What we have is a bunch of broken roads and dead ends. And if you're lost on those, good luck to you. It takes experts like me to half explain what's going on inside of them. And even the people who work on it 24/7 don't quite understand the tangled mess we've made of our safety net and economic mobility systems. So personally, I've developed a framework that, my own research agenda at Urban starts with a backward mapping approach. I always look at the intersection of household well-being. That's taken me into a lot of guaranteed income studies. Like, what do households say they need to flexibly address their own choices and needs for mobility? Then I pull the lens out to social networks. Who are they reaching out to help them with that? And then place-based, are their neighborhoods serving them well? And I find that lens coming from, again, the lived experience of people who are actually experiencing poverty and moving out through the lenses that most affect them and touch their kids and touch their lives, like social networks in place, then allows you to sort of make some judgments about the wraparound systems, whether it be safety net, all the things that are in the frame. Otherwise, it tends to remain a tangled mess. And you don't really get to what can help people to, not just get to the one goal of mobility out of poverty, but what are their personal goals? This is a thing that, across households, it's very hard to imagine our current systems scaling when in fact those systems do things like say, here's your food stamps, when what you really need is rent, or here's a high demand occupation. Go take a job in it, even if you're not particularly suited to it and it's a crap wage. That's what our systems do now. And that's why we have to listen to people who are impacted by them, because they'll tell us the way out.
Yeah, that's great. I would love to, and Mary, thank you, because I think you had a great segue into, what I want to do is test this premise that we have, which is that the space of economic mobility from poverty is too broad to really assess the field and to build a field around, because there is so much in it. And the premise really relies on the idea that effective fields do lead to improved social outcomes. And I think there's a lot of case studies for this. Leanna shared some. Teenage pregnancy for me is one that I always go back to because I think you really did see a field form around that particular issue and saw dramatic improvement in the outcomes related to teenage pregnancy. Our sense is that using this three-field frame, there are outcomes that are associated with economic security, economic mobility, and value and belonging. And they are broadly, from the security perspective, for people who are in the fifth quintile of wealth. And I'm going to use wealth instead of income because we strongly believe that wealth is the more important of the two measures. For people who are in the lowest quintile, fifth quintile around wealth, what is that experience? And Gary, you mentioned, as a developed country, the US spends the least amount on our safety net. It really gets to what is that experience like? What is the experience of poverty for people in the US? The second field around economic mobility, how much friction is there between moving from one quintile to another quintile? And do we have effectively, a caste system, which, sort of where the quintile in which you're born predetermines where you will end up in those quintiles. And then from a value and belonging perspective, I think you introduce all the elements around racial disparities, all disparities based on identity, the experience of othering, and how do we build a more cohesive economic system so that people are not excluded, based on race, ethnicity, identity. So the question is that premise? Do you agree with the premise that this space is too large and it would benefit from a little bit more clarity around which of these issues and the outcomes that we're working towards? Mary, I think you teed that up nicely. But Gary, I would maybe turn to you and ask that question. How do you react to our premise around the difficulty with this large space?
Well, number one, when I looked at all three of those, there's a couple of lenses that need to be looked through for each one of those areas. So as far as it goes, I think great. That's a great framing. But unless you have a clear racial lens that you're looking at, and a gender lens, I would argue as well, not everyone's situated similarly in each one of those frames, meaning their access to opportunity may be totally different based on how they're situated. And so I think, those look universal to me. And what we've tried over and over again in this country is to use universal means to get at issues of differences for example, BIPOC communities versus whites. I'll give you an example of that. In the late 2000 or early 2000, I worked on, I was the director of planning and development for Hennepin County, which was in Minnesota, largest county there. And we did analysis of welfare reform. And what we found was that as welfare reform was implemented, we saw the roles get more brown and black. And part of that was due in part to what I think many of us know is that not everybody has the same situations. For example, African Americans have multiple issues happening, and whites may have episodic poverty at that level. So that's on the left side of the screen, which changes the dynamics of what your solution should be. And then working with families, as Mary had talked about earlier, working directly with those families, we found that there were multiple issues happening at the same time for those families that are in deep end poverty. The same thing is true for working families, which is a little different dynamic. And so trying to make one solution fit all of the issues, I think, is going to be a difficult task to begin with. So I'd argue that. Then, you're dealing with complex adaptive systems, right? And so when you're dealing with complex adaptive systems, we try to put on this kind of lid over them to make it to simplify it. But I do think that we need a framework that actually takes into account the multiple systems at play. So I would say all of those systems are interacting with each other. and upon each other, those three areas that you're talking about. And then, the last piece you talked about was the ideological piece. And I think that sits at the center. John Nash, who was a game theorist and a Nobel Prize winner, had what he called the Nash equilibrium. And it was used in how groups operate in conflict with one another and how do you form a winning argument. And so part of it, the one side of the equation of his analysis says that, if the group that's in power doesn't see it in their interests or to really change the status quo, then we will remain in a status quo. The good side of that is that if the group that is out of power, that is in conflict, actually can form enough social cohesion, they can actually form a winning argument to change the dynamic of the game. Why do I mention this? In part, in 2019, Other and Belonging and Prosperity Now did a national survey asking questions about how Americans feel about economic mobility, what are the remedies, et cetera. And this is consistent in the data, 20% of whites said, we should do anything to change the dynamics for people of color, particularly Blacks. That was much different for Black and Brown people in the survey, who had a majority felt that we should take some major action. So without a change in that dynamic, we will continue to be mired in this kind of conflict, because who has the resources, the power, and the ability to change this isn't the people of color primarily, and poor whites, that are the subjects of a system that has been unfair and denied them access. So I'll stop there, but I have a few more things to say, but I don't want to hog up all the time. So I'm in league with Mary in the corner over here. I'm totally with her on how she framed the issue.
That's great. Thank you, Gary. Rachel, I know you work, as you mentioned, across all three of these fields. How does the framework, and how does the idea that being more explicit about which field or which outcome you're working towards, how might that shape your work, and is that a useful frame for you?
Yeah, I think it is really useful. I want to first say something about just the messiness of fields that I think is important to acknowledge, and then kind of react to the three-field framework and how it shows up. So, fields are messy, and it's normal for them to be messy. And I think what we need to parse is the messiness that is inherent to doing social and economic change work, and the kind that allows us to be unfocused or too splintered or uncoordinated, right? So, the marriage equality example comes up often in these types of conversations. And I know it's one of the examples you used. My wife and I got married 6 weeks after marriage equality. We were both very involved in the LGBTQ rights and equity movement and field. I will say that in that space, it felt and still feels really messy. There's a lot of different goals and competing priorities. There were even disagreements around marriage equality as a priority. And I will, for folks who aren't aware of this, there is a war and a pandemic going on after all. There is an unprecedented all-out attack today against LGBTQ and especially trans youth. And I was talking with a colleague at a Fortune 500 company the other day, and he said, we're evacuating our staff members from Ukraine, and we're offering evacuation to all of our staff members with trans people and their families in Texas. And that's my reality today, evacuations from Texas and Ukraine. So I name that because I'm really enraged, number one, at the moment as a queer person, but I also name that to say we act kind of like that work is done and this field reached this point of a huge victory, when in fact, in some ways, what's happening today is just as, if not more concerning than what was happening in 2010 and 2014 when we achieved these victories. So I think it's just important to remember that messiness and the dynamic nature of fields and the unfinished work. So that's kind of thing one. Thing two, when it comes to this three-field frame and the work that we all do, I very much agree that there are these different goals and lenses. And I do think it creates a lack of clarity in this larger space. It's actually part of why we exist as a funder collaborative, because just like these three fields exist for nonprofits, in the research space, as Mary said, in our government benefits, right? There's one for food insecurity over here and one for broadband access over here and rent over here. And that's not someone's life, right? That we don't splinter ourselves up like that. So just as it exists for all of these stakeholders, it also exists for the funding. And I think in some ways, the funding can end up reinforcing some of these artificial boundaries. And it's important that we don't do that as funders. So that's really part of why we wanted to create the Families and Workers Fund. In our collaborative, we have funders that are really leaders in each of these three fields. And it's complicated. It means that we don't agree on everything, right? But I will say that the work that I hear our members doing in talking across those fields, right, of saying like, I can remember an exchange, I won't name who it was, but if someone's saying, well, you know, worker power is the North Star for all of us. And another funder is saying, that's not my North Star. Actually, my North Star is around inclusive capitalism and a set of markets that deliver, you know, more shared prosperity. And there was sort of this aha moment of like, here we are doing this work together and we're not actually talking about the same North Star. So for me, I think what we do need is some sort of very high level mobilizing and inspiring North Star, but then it's okay for us to do this different work in our fields if we can do better about talking across and coordinating across. I think often what we're doing is coordinating within, and then we just sort of further the silos and fragmentation.
That's great, Ray. So I have a couple of places I would love to take that. I would love to just though build on the point you made about marriage equality and sort of the backsliding that I think that we are seeing right now. And a point that I want to make about field building is I have a close friend of our organization who talks about really what this is building field building is about building a muscle, right? It's about the connected tissue between stakeholders. It's about how do you get resourcing or energy into that field. And it's about building a muscle. But as with any muscle, you need to continue to exercise it or it atrophies. And I think there is an occasion that happens a lot where a policy win might be achieved, and you sort of think, okay, we've won that battle, and the muscle then atrophies. The field sort of devolves. And in this context, I think back to the child tax credit that was in place for 8 months maybe, and was rescinded at the beginning of the year. So I think there are corollaries in this mobility from poverty space, in particular around the economic security space, that we need to make sure we're exercising the muscle around this field, and not only getting the policy wins, but making sure they endure over the long term. The other point you made that I wanted to just get the panelists' perspectives on, it gets a little bit to Gary's point around ideology. I think one thing we believe is that this field frame could be inviting and encourage more collaboration from a broader set of stakeholders, a set of stakeholders who may be interested in mobility and more oriented around traditional views of the American dream, to really focus on mobility and how do we improve the conditions that allow mobility, that otherwise they might not be as animated or as interested in the safety net program or some of the parts of the field. And I wonder if that hypothesis rings true for you, or if you've seen evidence that maybe that wouldn't be the case, to be more inviting if we had clarity around the fields and the outcomes we were working towards. I don't know if anyone wants to pick that up, or I can also call on someone.
Yeah.
Gary, go ahead.
I'll try to tackle that. That was a big question you asked. That's why I was hesitating a little bit, because there was a lot to it. So this, there's two professors at the Humphrey School of Public Affairs that have written on this issue of collaboration. And one of their papers is called Failure into Collaboration, meaning to some degree, because you have folks that get kind of positioned in a particular field feel like they own the turf, that it's very difficult for them once they do that to collaborate with what they consider frenemies. So they're friends, but we're competing over these resources, and so we create more fragmentation about how we fund what the funding streams that get created to actually to do the work. And so, the RFP process and, the lowest bid process, all those things contribute to this issue of creating natural allies to work together. That doesn't say people don't work together, but usually it's because they see that it's in their interest to work together across their silo. And so, as a former funder and recovering from that, I've, spent 7 years funding in this space of poverty. I also was guilty of having the beauty contest and then funding this group and that without looking at the system as a whole, and then looking at how that system is operating, and then working to lift the whole system up instead of just my pick of the week or this pick over here. And so we have, that dynamic persist in part because of how philanthropy is structured to some degree around these issues. But philanthropy by itself, even with all its muscle and its resources, it really is not the place where these problems have to be solved. It really has to be, I would argue, government intervention at a massive scale to address the problems that we're trying to see. Now, nobody wants to hear that. People talk about, that we shouldn't have any kind of redistribution strategy at all. But I don't know how you get there from here. Meaning, given the size of the problem on each of those panels that you have, I don't know how you have just a philanthropic strategy to address that. It really is a public policy priority. And I'll say this lastly, when we look at the major changes that have happened in this country, the New Deal comes out as one of the major changes that actually created the white middle class in America, that reshaped America in different ways, where people of color didn't participate in that uplift, if you will. And Robert Putnam, in his book Upswing, actually documents the fact that Blacks are worse off economically today than they were in 1968. Blacks had one of the highest marriage rates in the country in 1960, and now have the lowest marriage rate in the country. And these dynamics of public policy that has really shaped how economic mobility happens in this country. So I actually think it can't be a program that we're talking about or an initiative. It really has to be big bets at this inflection point that we're at today.
Yeah, I'll follow up on what Gary's saying and just second his earlier point about using racial equity lenses here too. It's so important to really look at different groups and how they're affected and where the disparities come from, including in current day systems and historical systems. I started with the example of urban, my institution itself, being siloed, because I do think frameworks like this one, Ted, are really helpful to getting sort of the professional level people, the researchers, the philanthropists, the program developers, the government actors, to have a common language, right? To say, oh, it's not a bunch of we know we're in a bunch of broken roads and dead ends and all these silos, but really across economic security and economic mobility, under which you incorporate wealth building. I often add that as a third leg, but that's the one highway, right? But I do think, and I want to return to the lived experience comments I made earlier, in that you really can't break through the paradigms, even like the different philosophical frames people have, unless you start to have the plain spoken language of real people who are impacted by these issues in the conversation. Because they're going to tell you. Early childhood system, something I'm steeped in, good example. You go out there, and I was part of developing early Head Start back in the late 1990s. And I'll tell you, it's a great system. It's done a lot of great work. There are partnerships that cut across silos between, childcare and early childhood, but a lot of it pushes center or home-based care. And if you talk to the average parent out there, a lot of them will tell you, I want my child cared for by a friend or a family member. And they don't want to hear all the quality concerns and setting concerns that professionals have about that. They figure, okay, go ahead and take care of that if you got some regulatory solutions. But we want, this is what our choice culturally would be, what we want to have happen in our communities. And then you can take the framework, the highway, and sit at tables with folks where the lived experience becomes part of the decision-making tables even. And you can see great examples of this in places like Colorado, their Family Voice Council, et cetera. And say, okay, then how are we going to make the systems work for what real people really say they need, which is kith and kin care. And yeah, we don't want the public dollar paying for something that's not high quality or in a safe setting for children, but there are ways around that. It's just the systems aren't pushed hard enough to see it from the point of view of the customer of the system. I mean, really, when you think about the sort of mobility field or industry, such as it is, the collection of things going on, it is the least customer focused industry, the poverty industry, et cetera, in this country. We don't ask people. We just do, and we do it from on high rather than backward mapping it from the perspective of people who are really affected. And that's a huge problem.
Yeah, thank you, Mary. And I want to just I would love to add something that we learned or heard from this work, which is an example of, I think, incredible field building in this space is, Leanna mentioned this earlier also, the work of Opportunity Insights and Raj Chetty, who I think have added an incredible amount of quantitative analysis to the space around economic mobility and what are the factors that lead someone to have economic mobility or not. But what I think what that field realizes now is there's an incredible amount of quantitative research that tees up the questions but doesn't answer any of those questions. And what it will take is qualitative research, more engagement with people who are experiencing these things to understand why and how do we develop and aligned strategies to address those. So that's, I think it reinforces though this idea that fields are effective, but it's a long journey. It's not just about organizing the field, it's about knowing what questions ask and then engaging the right set of folks around how do we align our strategies around those. Rachel, anything that you wanted to add to that conversation around the field and sort of how it might be inviting for different stakeholders to come together around?
Yeah, well, I just really appreciated both of your comments, Gary and Mary, and really appreciated, Gary, you bringing the New Deal into this conversation. I will say, I think about this a lot, and it's a big motivation for why I'm even in this work and doing this work. I really consider the New Deal as the reason why my family is economically secure and is what it is. And I think it's actually important for more white people to trace that in their own family history. So essentially, like before the New Deal, my family was Jewish immigrants and refugees from Eastern Europe living in poverty with no access to literacy and education. And essentially on the other side of the New Deal, there was economic security and pathways for mobility. And it was paired with other things, employer anti-discrimination efforts and things that were sort of encouraged via the New Deal and post-World War II era. But I'm so grateful you brought that in, because I think it's important to remember actually that the outcomes that we're trying to solve are actually all choices that were made in our policy, right? And that have been then scaled through also employers and our benefit system. And there are choices that can be changed today. So I just want to kind of name that and appreciate that. I do think when I think about philanthropy and what it takes to do less siloed philanthropy and more collaborative philanthropy, that insight and key point that Gary made is front and center for me, because ultimately, philanthropically funded programs will not scale change, right? Change is going to scale through government and policy, through markets, or through social movements and people power. Like those are the ways things have changed in this country, through those three pathways. So to me, the role of philanthropy is ultimately to ensure that we are using our resources as, maybe it's early risk capital, it's risk capital in the public interest, to support leaders that are really going down those pathways to scale. So at Families and Workers Fund, for example, a lot of the work we do is explicitly and officially in partnership with government. We just launched an MOU with the Department of Labor around measuring good quality jobs. So I do think that this field framework and this idea of locating the levers of change in it can be a really helpful tool for philanthropy.
That's great. Thank you, Rachel. I would love to, we have just about a few minutes left, and I would love to end on a positive note. And one of the questions that, and I think this has come up a bit in the chat as well, what if you could maybe just highlight some of the successes, and I think Rachel began to do that with her comments, some of the successes that you've seen in the last couple of years, and maybe if you're able to trace that to some notion of field building, or how a field supported that policy win or alignment win. I would love to just end maybe the conversation with that, something that has been successful over the last couple of years.
I have a good one.
Great,
Ted.
Mary, thanks.
I work very closely and have over the years with Ascend at the Aspen Institute, which takes a 2-generation approach to economic security and mobility. They've had a framework going for a while now, and they have a state network, states that have signed on to 2-gen programming. And the downside is that when political administrations change, you can see some of the network building like collapse. But there are sustainable pieces. And I just referenced, for example, Ascend has set a set of principles that point right to outcomes, point right to attention to equity, having that equity lens Gary talks about, and also point, to blending and braiding policy streams, but also to family voices at very high levels of decision making. And I have seen them have some extraordinary wins in that work. Because they're getting right into and standing next to and even providing sort of exploration grants to state government entities and their partners to say, okay, how are you going to reframe your work? So I mentioned it earlier, is the Family Voice Council of the Colorado Department of Human Services. They've issued an impact report, and it's extraordinary what that council has done, because it's put, heads of their child welfare system, their behavioral health systems operators, right in the same rooms with a standing group of people who are impacted by these policies, who have become very conversant in how to talk about the systems themselves, provide input, and help them to untangle the mess we've made of these systems by not backward mapping them properly from family points of view. So I've considered a lot of that. I mean, you see Washington State's 10-year plan to reduce poverty, to eradicate poverty, I think it is. That's huge equity lens in there, a lot of family voices on the governor's work group. I think that's where you can see, and again, there are frameworks for these, but the framework is being informed from the lived experience up. It is very hard to take that stuff to scale, but not impossible. And that is where we need to go if we're ever going to get anywhere.
Thank you, Mary. Gary, I see you come off mute.
Yeah, I'll just mention a few things. One is in 2019, the VITA Permanency Act took place. And this is really about volunteers tax assistance. And we know that at tax time is one of the #1 times that families actually can sign up for their earned income tax credit in various state and federal programs that move them and lift them out of poverty. And by making that permanent, it made a real difference. I think that was a real win. It wasn't, everything, but it was a win in terms of getting resources in the hands of low and moderate income people. You mentioned the child care tax credit. The data is out, folks. We know it works. We need to make it permanent, and we won't rest until it happens, meaning ensuring that families have that. And then our analysis with Derek Hamilton and others say that the one way we can move this agenda is through baby bonds. which is an investment at an early age in our babies, that actually when they turn 18, they have enough to invest in themselves. We believe within a generation, we can address the racial wealth divide in America if we implement this strategy. And we're seeing it happen at the state level all over the place. And so we're hoping that we can gain momentum, but it is our North Star because we can't see anything big enough to solve the problem. We go around with solutions that actually, if we came to Target and said, I've got a product and I've got 50 of them, would you put them in all your stores? It wouldn't work, right? I mean, Target could never accept that. They need to operate at scale. We need to operate at scale with the solutions that we have. Otherwise, we'll be here 25 years, 50 years from now, having the same conversation about the field. I think the work that you all have done is great. We certainly will use this work in what we're doing. So I don't want to say that it's not not helpful in any way, because it really is. But we also need to take that work and then apply that lens that I talked about earlier, or we're going to just be doing the same thing. We're going to be like Sisyphus, moving the boulder up the mountain and then rolling it back down again. And that's what we've seen of the vicissitudes that people live in. This issue of who has the answers, and Mary nailed this, we believe that the answers are in the communities that we work with. And we work with over 25,000 organizations throughout this country trying to address issues of economic mobility. And I can tell you that there's more wisdom in those communities than me just coming out with another report saying how devastating this is. There's more resilience in these communities. So we need to listen to those folks and apply it to what we're trying to do here. So thank you so much for having me. This is a fantastic conversation.
That's great. Thank you, Gary. Rachel, with the last couple of minutes, would love to hear your successes in this field.
Yeah, I feel like I've got to come through with a big success since I talked about evacuating families from Texas. So let's end on an uplifting note here, which is, I want to really go with what Gary and Mary are saying about the fact that the wisdom and the solutions live with the folks who are most directly impacted, right? And I will lift up an exciting example that you can expect more soon to be announced big wins from. So as we think about the economic recovery, there's been nearly $7 trillion in federal government funding allocated for relief and recovery. The question is, will that ultimately turn into good family sustaining jobs that actually are actually equitable, and we don't see racial and gender disparities? So one of our grantee partners, the Workers Defense Project in Texas, small, scrappy nonprofit created by immigrant construction workers, they developed a set of this is what a good job looks like for us. This is what we would need to be for our families to be sustained and okay for us to feel that our work is worthwhile. It has now been adopted in $2 billion worth of construction deals in Texas. And it's through a combination of push and pull. There's some incentives states have provided. Now companies are really eager for it. And my belief is as this recovery money and especially infrastructure money really rolls out in places like Texas, that I actually anticipate that those numbers will more than double, and that tens of thousands of families will be potentially impacted by this really historic public investment if we can get it situated right and get those good job standards baked into it.
That's great. Well, I'm leaving this feeling inspired by those great examples that all three of you shared. I think the key is to, as we talked about, continue building the muscle and then continue to exercise the muscle around these fields and the way we collaborate, getting resourcing to these fields. And as you said, lifting up the voices of people who are most impacted is so critical. We would love to continue this conversation on our LinkedIn page. If you're on if you're listening to this and want to continue, you can check that out at our LinkedIn page, Camber Collective. We're going to curate all the questions and have sort of an ongoing dialogue there. Panelists, thank you so much for your wisdom and your generosity with your time. Attendees, thank you for joining us and your engagement. And we'll look forward to continuing this conversation. Thanks all.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.